Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to this series on ESG, analytics and green finance. My name is Atul Tripathi and I'm Honorary Adjunct Fellow at National Maritime Foundation. So in the first of the 20 lecture series, we will be talking about the matrices, the ESG matrices, the science, what is the aspects behind, various aspects behind, analytical aspects behind this subject of ESG. So let's start off with this subject at all. Now let's look at the first one, the ESG analytics and the green finance of the world. So today what is happening is we are going beyond the ESG checklists. We are getting into the hardcore climate sciences, which is driving the financial risks and the green financial strategies that you need to have across the board, globally particularly, So if you observe, the temperatures are warming up, and as per IPCC ARC 62021, the global temperatures have already risen and increased by about 1.2 degrees centigrade. That is above the pre-industrial levels, and this is impacting on the global greenhouse gases emission. So in 2022, as you can clearly see, it's about 57.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide as per United Nations Environment Framework, while it was about 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2022 alone itself. That also brings to another important aspect, and that is the reason is the financial aspect that we need to look at. So any kind of a ESG or emissions that is there. So one of the important things that the banks are looking at is the financial impact that it's going to have. So climate-related disasters, what is happening around, it's been estimated that about $360 billion has been in economic losses as per Swiss Re, their 2 to 3 years report. And then there is a transition risks, which is about carbon pricing, regulatory tightening, and that is standing out about $900 billion into fossil fuel assets by 2023. That is as per IEA report. And that also brings us to another point is about the green finance growth. There are about 73 green initiatives, carbon financing pricing initiatives that have been taken. This is covering about 23% of the GHG emissions as per the World Bank. And the global sustainability investment assets have surpassed about $39 trillion in 2023 itself, projected to grow by $50 trillion by 2025. That is as per the Global Sustainability Investment Alliance 2023 reports. Now, as far as the physical aspect is concerned, by 2025, over 570 cities which will be impacted, about 800 million people will be exposed to rising sea levels. Now, this is as per C40 cities report in 2023. Now, you can quite well imagine what is going to be the impact on the banking industry, the real estate industry, the insurance sector, and all other sectors. The impact as far as the human lives is concerned, the agriculture sector. This is something we will be discussing in the coming series in the upcoming series. So let's look at the first thing, invisible forces, what are the global consequences, and where is this greenhouses, cases driving up the climate change. Now, this GHG is trapping around about, I would say, they've got a blanket about carbon dioxide stays for centuries, But the methane is the one that punches above its weight. So when I say methane is punching above the weight, what I mean is that the source is primarily livestock, the rice paddies, landfills, that is for the methane, and the potency is 25 times more than that of carbon dioxide. So quite well imagine 25 times, that is for about 100-year period. That is a big year. That is one thing you're looking at, And the lifespan is at least greater than or approximately 12 years, but with strong term climate impact changes. That's a big thing that you're looking at, And nitrous oxide, as we call them. Basically, they're coming from nitrogen-based fertilizers or biomass burning or water waste, industrial processes, and their potency is 273 times bigger. You can quite well imagine what it's going to be. So that's a huge one. Then comes in your fluorinated gases, like synthetic or high-impact warmers, like CFCs, PFCs, SFs, NF3s, they have got a huge one, and the lifespan is ranging all the way from 23,000 times. It's going to be greater than carbon dioxide. Now, why I wanted to bring out this is because we often tend to get mired with a lot of these information, And it's important to understand where and what is impacting the climate change. Because if you want to understand the impact of the climate change on the business and finance, we need to understand the various sources from where it is coming from. So this is where I wanted to start off with. And that also brings me to another point, is about carbon spiral. So climate feedbacks are nature's amplifiers. That is what IPCC AR 62021 report says. And what we trigger is what is going to be echoing for centuries. That is something that I talked about in my previous slide. So when we talk about this thing, if you can clearly see the carbon spiral that is taking place. So the carbon life cycle has got its own ways of looking at it. It's circulating continuously, whether in the atmosphere or the biosphere or the oceans, geosphere, which is coming in terms of fossil fuels, the sediments, and the balance is coming in terms of stability in the millennia, which is being disrupted. So you have the feedback mechanism that is worsening, and it's warming and worsening every time. So you have ice albedo feedbacks, which is important to understand, where the ice is reflecting the sunlight and the ice is melting. So the darker the ocean becomes, the more land is absorbing more heat, and this is accelerating the warming and the further melting of the ice caps, and that is called a self-reinforcement loop. A very important point. Then we have something concept called as permafrost methane release, where the Arctic permafrost is storing vast amounts of frozen methane, and as it thaws, as I said in my previous slide talked about it, that methane is going to be released, which is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide released over 20 years. Then you have the ocean saturation feedback concept, where the oceans are absorbing about 20 to 25 to 30% of carbon dioxide emissions. Now, as the oceans begin to warm, it's going to impact the economics, it's going to impact the oceanic life cycles, and take is going to decline as oceans begin to warm, and that's going to leave more of GHG gases, So that is what is happening, and as far as the carbon spiral feedback is concerned, it's a completely, I would say, a life cycle in its own, and it's having a own feedback loop all the way. And that is where you see the weather is turning white. Now look at this, what was once in a century event now strikes every few years, and climate is no more stable. If you look at this world map, you can clearly see what's happening, what kind of impact is happening. How is it changing? What are the main areas you're looking at as far as the kind of heat or the impact, as far as the kind of, I would say, the dryness or the cold weather, or whether it is extremely hot weather, humid weather? What are the main hotspots we are looking at? Singapore, Dubai, Sao Paulo, Rome, LA, Brussels, London, all the important cities of the world at this time period. And that is where the rising frequency and the intensity of the extremities is taking place, because the climate change is actually amplifying your natural variability, which is making heat waves, which is creating floods, which is creating storms. And the heat waves and wildfires, if you look at it across the world, 2022, the European heat wave, Spain recorded about 47 degrees centigrade. That's too much for a country like Spain. UK exceeded 40 degrees centigrade. It was having a major health impact. For about 20,000 excess heat death causes were reported. So that is what has started to happen. The Australian bushfires, we remember way back in 2019 summer, that was a big thing, and that happened. And about 12 million hectares were burnt down, and the millions were killed, and there was a huge loss of biodiversity as far as the animals and the plants and trees and other things were concerned. Then storms and floods have been very frequent. The category 4 and the category 5 storms, some of the examples are Hurricane Ian or Cyclone Mocha that have been there. Then who doesn't forget the floods in Pakistan in 2022, where there was about 1/3 of the country was completely inundated, and 33 million people were displaced. The Horn of Africa has been facing droughts continuously, and it's become a big challenge, particularly when there has been a record of 5 failed rainy seasons altogether. So the climate amplification, when we look at the heat, the moisture that is being trapped by the greenhouse gases, it is increasing the energy in the climate system. It is causing more extremes. The weather extremes are no more an isolated incidents. They are completely interconnected systems as far as the disruption of the Earth system is concerned. And why does it matter? The question happens to be it. Is it only just a matter of events? No, it has also got financial implications as well. So till now, the economic toll of climate-linked disasters have exceeded $313 billion in 2022 itself. That was globally. And this is as per Swiss RE. the infrastructure collapse, the migration, the food insecurity, the public health emergencies, they're only increasing day by day by day. So that is where your preparedness, adaptation, emission cuts, and they're all becoming very, very essential. So if you look at another point is, how do you simulate the future? That's an important. That's what we're going to be talking about. So climate models are not like crystal balls. They're most powerful tools when we have been able to map the risks, we have been able to guide the resilience and hold emitters accountable. Because in today's models, you can do multiple futures you can look at, prepare for the most profitable one. You have a concept of GCM, general circulation models, engines that are behind the climate forecasting. They are basically computer-based simulations where high-end physics and chemistry and mathematics and fluid dynamics is understood or is tried to figure out a way to simulate or mimic the Earth's complex climatic systems. They're able to track how energy flows, what is the way in which the water flows, how the gases flow across the oceans, the streams, the atmospheric pressures, how is it impacting the ice, and then the impact on the land as well. And then you validate it against historical climate data so that you get a reliability factor. Then you have, RCPs and SSPs. RCP stands for Representative Concentration Pathways. These are scenarios of future greenhouse gases concentration. So you have RCP 2.6, which is talking about low emissions, and you have RCP 8.5, which is talking about high emissions altogether. Then you have shared economic pathways, SSPs, integrated global development trends, where you're talking about sustainability, your fossil fuel growth. These scenarios, they are allowing you to forecasting the global temperature rises, the sea level changes, the extreme weather likelihood is going to happen by the end of the century. Because you see, any of these events that are taking place, it cannot be simulated only for 1 year or so. We're looking at a long-term scenario. So that generally we tend to take it from 50 years to 70 years to about 100 years altogether. Then there are various applications that has been attributed to the science. So GCMs, as I talked about, general circulation models, that would have happened because without the anthropogenic model emissions that are there, because they're able to provide foundations of event attribution models and the climatic forensics that is so you're moving beyond the science. You're calling for tools for action now. It's here that the governments have started to craft climate action plan based on carbon budgets. It is helping the bankers, the insurers, the investors to understand the financial implications and the risks that are associated with the climate risk. And that is what the focus of this entire course is all about. How will you aid the military and the disaster agencies to be prepared before the arrival, or even if you're able to predict the event that is going to take place. Most importantly, because we've had the decades of future risks, the climate models will make sure that there is a scientifically planned approach which can be attributed to a legal action or evidence-based engines can be done. This is a very important point where we're going to be looking at simulating the future and how the climate models are, forecasting the risks altogether. Another thing is important is why is climate chaotic such a climate capital risk? Because you can clearly see that $4.3 trillion in global assets are at risk. That's a big number you're looking at, Climate-related impacts by 2100 by the end of the century, and this is by Swiss Re 2021 report. Only 8% of economic losses from natural disasters were insured. Only 8%. So just imagine what is happening. So this is what Munich Re NatCat 2023 report talks about. Now just imagine the impact that is happening on the landscape of the climate finance, and that is where climate risk, what we refer to as a potential negative impact on climate change on economic, social and environmental system is to be looked at. It is including your direct threats like your natural disasters, and your indirect threats like your regulatory changes that are required, the legal liabilities, what about the reputational damage? That's where it's becoming very important. And 6 out of 10 global risks by likelihood are related to the climate and the environmental degradation. So why should a financial, that brings me to another question, why should a financial institution care about, Primarily because of the valuation of assets, the portfolios that they're looking at, the insurance liabilities, and even the national credit worthiness. And it is becoming an important key dimension for enterprise risk management, your investor due diligence. So Take the case of a European Central Bank, which has found that 80% of euro area banks are exposed to climate-related financial risks through their lending books. That is as per the reports in 2022. Now, when you look at the financial impacts and non-financial impacts, you look at as far as the financial impacts are concerned, you're looking at asset devaluations or stranded assets. We'll talk about the stranded assets concepts and devaluation of the asset, the supply chain breakdowns in coming time. We'll just talk about that. The insurance price volatility, how is it impacting? The non-financial impacts is primarily around human migration, the loss of life, the biodiversity loss, the displacement, the impact on trust erosion. What about the ESG compliance failures, your reputational damages that are there? So BlackRock is estimating that the climate change could cost global economy about $2.5 trillion in stranded assets by 2050. So this is very much going to happen within our lifespans, most of our lifespans, I would say. So climate is not just an environmental issue. It is a systemic financial risk you're looking at. And the failing to measure it is as good as you're flying blind into a storm. That is very important for any bank, for any financial institution you're looking at. And that is where these aspects are very important. Let's look at another point. When the nature is going to strike back, how are you going to map your world's acute climate shocks? So more than 43% of natural disasters in the last decade were climate related. And they are growing more violently. So the violence of nature itself is growing. And therefore, this is coming from the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. Look at the spatial distribution of the technological hazards that are there, or the natural hazards that have happened. Look at them. Look at the kind of impact the natural disasters that have happened, from epidemic to earthquakes to mass movements to extreme temperatures. Look at this. Floods have been the biggest one. Look at this one. Look at that one. Then you have storms, which have become very, very big thing. So this is becoming an important point, because we see as the oceans are growing warmer, they are fueling stronger and wetter currents. So take the case of Hurricane Ian. That has caused about $112 billion damages, and it's been the 5th costliest US storm. And studies show that 50% increase in category 4 and 5 storms over the last 4 decades. This is as per Nature Communications 2020 reports. Floods have become another point. They're completely drowning the infrastructure. Right from the rising sea levels to extreme rainfalls, that is all as good as compounding the flood risks. Then you have the wildfires, which is blazing beyond control. 2023 Canada wildfires, which has cost about 18 million hectares, which has been the largest in the history. And this wildfire smoke has cost up to 339,000. That is 339,000 premature deaths annually. This is coming from the World Health Organization estimates. You see, I had told a few minutes back, the impact on the health is becoming very severe. Then the droughts. The droughts are affecting the agriculture, the water scarcity, the migration patterns. So Horn of Africa has already had 5 failed rainy seasons starting from 2019 to 2023. And this has impacted over 40 million people. And therefore, the global drought exposure has increased by 29% in the last 2 decades. That is as per WMO 2023. So these are not isolated catastrophes you're looking at. They're all interconnected. They're intensifying. They're disproportionately impacting the world's most vulnerable populations. And they're causing acute financial and physical risks that are defining the factor of, whether it is in terms of financials, whether in terms of operations, or even humanitarian planning, all together over the place. Now, when we look at this slow and burning deep impact, what is happening around it? Look at this. Look at by 2100, over 800 million people could be living in cities that is going to threaten chronic flooding due to rising sea levels. This is as per the World Bank climate change report. Look at the way, the impact that we're looking at complete over the places. Look at this world map. It is not just disasters you see that on the news channels you're looking at. You're looking at climate risks And they're redrawing the coastal boundaries, they're reshaping the cities, they're rewriting the entire history altogether. It's going to have a long-term impact in terms of cumulative climate shifts, whether disrupting your economics or environmental or social systems. And unlike acute events, chronic risks are predictable but unstoppable if unmitigated. That's a very important point. And, driven by the glacial melting and thermal expansions, the threatening of the coastal cities, the naval infrastructure that is there, your ports, freshwater sources, these are all going to be under stress. So if you look at the global sea levels, they have risen by 20 centimeters since 1900. And if the warming continues unchecked, it is projected that it's going to rise by 1 meter by 2100. This is as per IPCC AR6 2023 report. And 40% of the world's population is living in these places within 100 kilometers of the coast. So in fact, in India, if you look at it, Mumbai and Kolkata are the ones that are the biggest megacities in India that are under risk because of the rising sea level. And it is estimated by 2050, 36 million Indians could have been exposed to annual flooding. Look at the heat waves. They're becoming more and more frequent, and they become more stronger and more lethal in nature. It is impacting not only your agriculture, but also your labor productivity. Your energy demands are going up. Your public health infrastructure is at stress. So by 2023, Europe had recorded 61,000 excess deaths due to heat wave. This is as per Lancet Countdown 2023 report. And India has seen an extreme heat index levels rising across 22 states in May in 2024. This is straining the entire hospitals, the entire systems of the health, the grid systems that we have. So your outdoor labor productivity in South Asia is projected to drop by 15% by 2050 due to extreme heat. The change in the rainfall, the weather patterns, they are altering your crop cycles, your hydropower generations, your drinking waters. Take the case of India, as the monsoon is becoming less predictable, with 30% high inter-annual variability you're looking at, that is affecting your agriculture, your food security. And the World Bank estimates that the climate-induced water stress could reduce GDP up by 6% in South Asia by 2050. This is without mitigation we are looking at. So chronic climate risks are at a silent siege engines of the 21st century. And they are redrawing the entire coastlines. They are overheating our cities. They're disrupting the life as we know as. A new set of rules are being written now. How the policy is going to be reshaping, what is going to happen to the business strategies. If you look at 70 jurisdictions now price carbon covering over 23% approximately of global emissions, but experts say prices may triple by 23, will increase because of, to meet the climate goals. This is as per the World Bank and that is state and trending, carbon pricing 2024 reports. So what you're looking at is a complete transitional risks that is a business is facing, that the governments are facing. How is it shifting to towards low carbon economy, which is being triggered by sudden policy changes, your regulatory tightening, your ESG expectations, The forces, they are emitting, force emitters are required to pay for the carbon footprint, either through carbon tax or through cap and trade systems. And the companies that fail to reduce the emissions are going to face rising operational costs or regulatory penalties. Now, as of 2024, approximately, 73 carbon pricing initiatives are in operations worldwide. That is covering about 23% of global GHG emissions. This is as per the World Bank report in 2024. So there are going to be emission caps, which is going to be hard limits on sectoral as well as national emissions. There's going to be enforcement of regulations. There will be severe penalties. Sectoral benchmarks are being set up by the governments and the agencies and the regulators. This is pushing up your firms towards green innovations and risk obsolescence. Take the case of China, which is having a dual control of policy mandate for emissions to intensity to cut as per GDP unit. US's EPA has proposed rules that may force coal plants to close by 2035 if they're not equipped with carbon capture. You will be having ESG disclosure mandates. Companies are now required to report the environment, social, government risks that are there. It's becoming very mandatory in regions like US and SEC compliant climate risk areas that have come into picture. India is also under the discussions to have its own SEBI BRSR code initiative to take place. So the investor behavior is changing. So over $40 trillion in global AUM is now aligned to ESG mandates, which is meaning that they're able to access to capital now depends more on the transparency on ESG factors that the companies are applying to. You're going to have high emission sectors like, so this is going to have a compliance impact is going to be very high, particularly for changing business models in areas that are having high emission sectors like energy, cement, automotive, aviations. They'll be either forced to adapt or they'll be completely declining over a time period if they do not follow the ESG mandates and the greenhouse emission mandates. So new policies will be there. There'll be new winners that we will be seeing coming days and new green tech technologies that are going to be there. And the losers will be high-end, these carbon heavy emitting industries that will be there. So markets will be in motion, and that is where the disruption is going to be causing. So $40 trillion in capital is on the move. That's the number we look at, $40 trillion. And it's abandoning the carbon for clean energies. So as of 2024, about 1,600 institutions are controlling about $40 trillion that have been committed for fossil fuel divestment. This is as per Divestment Global Tracker, if you can see that. So look at the way the economies have started to move towards, the markets have started to make transitions. And these are risks that are being changing because of the change in the consumer preferences, investment flows, technological breakthroughs, and the response to climate change and concerns. So companies are now clinging on to they're removing of the ones that are clinging on to the outdated models, that are becoming stranded assets that are valuable only on paper and they're worthless in practice. That is what we call it. Fossil fuel divestments are taking place. So major financial institutions and pension funds are pulling investments from fossil heavy portfolios. So let me give an example. $40 trillion in institutional assets globally are committed, as I said. They're committed over the fossil fuel disinvestment. This is having an impact on the oil and gas itself, oil and gas industry. You have the Exxon Mobil and the Shells of the world are facing rising cost capital and the investment pressure on the ESG performance. The insurance players, they're all withdrawing from underwriting from coal-fired projects because they're calling it now climate liabilities. So there is a rise of the green technologies you will see around. From solar and wind to hydrogen and battery storage, the green tech revolution is here to stay. The renewable energy investments has hit about $1.8 trillion in 2023 itself and is overtaking the fossil fuels. This is as per IEA report. The cost of solar powered vehicles have dropped from 89% in 2010 to 2022. And it's becoming easier and now cheaper than coal in most of the regions. So your electric EV market explosions is taking place. That in 2024, 1 in 5 cars sold globally were electric. This is as per IEA report. And China, EU, California and US, they're all phasing out the internal combustion engines by 2035. So your EVs are disrupting your legacy industries. And that is where your automotive and oil industries, they are rewriting the global capital flows and they are being hit because there is a technology plus policy shift that is taking place. Your traditional automakers, who have invested billions are now moving towards electric vehicles. Some of the classic examples are Tesla, BYD, Rivian. They're all becoming market leaders without a combustion engine that is in sight. The petrol station networks and ICE supply chains are facing existential threat also. So the oil demand for transport is projected to peak by 2026, and then we will see a decline in this area. There's a complete disruption as far as the capital flows are concerned in this field. Now, what is happening? There's another interesting thing that's happening. The courtroom battles that are being fought around as far as the carbon is concerned. So climate change is no longer, let me repeat, no longer just a science or a policy issue. It's a legal battle where reputations, revenues and executives, they're all on trial. You have the number of climate-related lawsuits worldwide, they have doubled since 2017. They are reaching about 2,500 cases over 65 jurisdictions by 2023. This is as per UNEP Global Climate Litigation Report. Look at the number of climate laws and policies across the world. And what is the country which is having the gas impacts, as per CAIT report 2016? Look at this global map. It gives you a very clear indicator of what is happening as far as the courtroom dramas are concerned, as we call them. There's an explosion because, as I said, about 2,500 cases are there across the globe. This is basically about 300% increase from 2017 to 2023. Then there is greenwashing that is taking place under the legal microscope. What I mean by greenwashing? This greenwashing is referring to a deceptive environmental claims to appear more sustainable than reality. Let me repeat that. Greenwashing is referring to making deceptive environmental claims to appear more sustainable than reality. So you have cases like ExxonMobil and BP that are facing investigations and shareholder lawsuits over leading or rather misleading your ESG marketing strategies. In the US, SEC's Climate and ESG Task Force is actively investigating the greenwashing that is taking place. This is indicating or signaling your regulatory tightening of the noose around the companies. Then you have a lot of emerging legal frontiers like your ESG disclosures that are taking place, that's leading to your investor lawsuits, your reputational damage, whether in, the directors and the officers, they are facing penalties. Personally, they are facing penalties if the compliance is not there. So the climate change litigation is talking about, being sued by various organizations and governments and shareholders so as to impact the climate change that is to be taking place. The greenwashing from marketing to misconduct, your lawsuits and investigations are targeting your companies because of the lack of ESG claims or misreported ESG claims. Your disclosure failures, your director liabilities are increasing. So primarily because they are unable to, there's a failure to disclose the climate risks in the financial regulatory report that are triggering your tighter securities laws violation. Now, another important impacting, and we've talked about the stranded assets we were talking about a few minutes ago. What is a stranded asset? As the world decarbonizes, trillions of assets that are there, from oil rigs to waterfront condos, they are facing an abrupt and irreversible fall from value. So about over $1 trillion worth in fossil fuel assets could be stranded by 2030. And that is successfully energy transition. This is as per IEA and Carbon Tracker 2023 reports. Basically, what are stranded assets? Let's try and understand that. These are assets that have lost value or have become obsolete due to environmental, regulatory, or market changes. This includes your coal mines, your gas plants, your high-risk coastal real assets, your even outdated infrastructure. So, let's look at the case of fossil fuel. 90% of the known fossil fuel reserves cannot be burned to meet global climate targets. Companies like BP and Shell, they have written off tens of billions in reserves due to revised climate outlooks. You have the real estate exposures. Coastal properties are facing rising insurance premiums and value in depreciation. In US alone, $108 billion in property value is being projected to lose due to rising sea levels by 2100, by the end of the century. Then there is infrastructure obsolescence. Where you're talking about airports, ports, power plants. They are being designed for climate norms, to meet the climate norms, so that they may not become unusable due to under extreme weather volatility conditions. You have the investment portfolios in infrastructure that is needing a rapid reassessment. You have the investor reactions that are coming back. The sovereign wealth funds, the pension plans, they're all divesting from the carbon heavy sectors. And why does it matter? Because you have the future military bases, your public infrastructure, your national reserves. They must factor in the climate adjusted asset planning in order to avoid long-term losses. That is why the stranded assets has become a big issue as far as the insurance companies and the banking sector is concerned. Now, what about the insurance? I mean, this is a big problem. It's becoming too risky altogether because the climate change is becoming the new geographical coverage. Even insurers are starting to walk away. They're no longer interested because 1 in 25 Australian homes could be 1 in 25, let me be. They could be effectively uninsurable by 2030 due to climate risk. This is as per Climate Council report N20. That's the kind of losses you're looking at. So because there is a rise in the climate, the premiums are rising, and that's becoming your new normal because the insurance cost is increasing. that your insurance retreat model is becoming real. So major insurers like State Farm and AIG have started to pull out of high-risk regions like California in US. They're basically citing untenable loss ratios. Your financial exclusion is becoming at the front. You have systemic financial impacts. If climate-related risks are becoming uninsurable, it is jeopardizing the entire local economies, your municipal bonds, your real estate markets, and what it means for the next generation. For future professionals, whether they are engineers, planners, investors, they must take into account the climate insurance linkages in the long-term decision making, because there's a very strong linking between climate risk and insurance economies. As the extreme weather becoming more and more frequent and severe, insurers are facing mountain of claims. There is a skyrocketing as far as the premium is concerned in climate hotspots. As I give 1 in 25 Australian homes, take the case of that. In Florida, the average flood insurance premium have risen over 100% in a decade. 100% in 1 decade. That's in 10 years. In Australia, the bushfire areas has seen a premium hike by 70 to 90%. That's a large number you're looking at. Areas that are prone to bushfires, particularly in public, because this is prompting a public backlash and the policy reviews. You have the era of insurance retreat, where major players like AIG, Allstate, State Farm, they have ceased to write new policies in high-risk zones. Places like in California, Louisiana. The reinsurers, they are tightening their exposure limits itself completely. They are increasing the cost for the primary insurers. And this is leading to a domino effect, whether from finance to lending to real estate, because without insurance, homes become ineligible for mortgages, therefore resulting in real estate devaluation. The municipal bonds are tied to vulnerable assets, areas for credit risk and lower investment appetite. So you have the societal impact that is coming into picture as far as the insurance crisis goes. And this insurance retreat can lead to climate gentrification, what is called as. Only wealthy are maybe able to buy houses in coming days. Let's take another aspect into climate, and that is your climate proofing finance. As I said, this course is about finance. It's about the focus on the finance and the analytics around it. What is it about? As the climate risk is growing in traditional models, the innovations, they're not retreating, and the new mandate for it is coming from the insurers. So the global parametric insurance market is projected to exceed by $29 billion by 2031. And it is growing at an annual of 10%. This is as per Allied Market Research 2023. Why is the traditional insurance failing? That's the question is that. Because there is a delayed in claims processing. Because there is subjective damage assessment that is happening. You have the unaffordable premiums that are increasingly becoming incompatible with today's climate volatility. The insurers are exiting your entire geographies because of due to lack of catastrophic risk loss. You have the parametric and insurance that is becoming fast and becoming transparent and becoming scalable. Let's take the case of even triggers. If you have a wind speed greater than 100 kilometers per hour or rainfall that is greater than 200 mm, not post-event damage inspections are allowed. For take the case of in the Caribbean, as per CCRIF SPC report, it has disbursed about millions of dollars in 14 days of hurricanes that are there. It's an ideal for agriculture, disaster relief, and SME business community. You have the catastrophe bonds that have started to come out, which is risky to transfer in the capital markets. And these are high-yield debt instruments where investors are bearing the risk of disaster payment. It is creating your resilience financing without burdening national budgets. This is an important topic, catastrophe bonds and parametric insurance. We will talk about it in coming lecture series in the same thing down the line. We'll find a more detailed discussion around it. So you have now got more AI-powered climate risk modelings where we are trying to predict, we're trying to price, we're trying to protect. The machine learning models that are there, they are being integrated with spatial data. The sensor feed, the historical climate trends that are there, they are being used by reinsurers such as Swiss Re's Sigma Explorer, AXA's Climate School to model the flood, plains, wildlife corridors, sea level encroachments, which is enabling them to have more precise pricing and better risk pooling and early environment warning systems that are there. And this is resulting in benefits for the innovations as well, because there is going to be a faster payouts, reduction in claim disputes, data-backed decision making. This is making the climate risk coverage viable, both in the most exposed zones, as well as making them more viable in terms of the policy factors that need to be taken into account, which is aligning with the ESG reporting and the sovereign resilience strategies that needs to be taken into consideration. So what actually it means for the future policymakers and professionals is that you need to understand the instruments that are going to be involved as far as the climate finance is concerned. You need to understand the future ESG leaders have to understand they have to start thinking beyond compliances and regulations. They have to think through systemic resilience that need to be built in, the financial innovation that they need to be put in. What are the new financial products that you need to look at as far as this reinsurance is concerned, or the climate-based reinsurance is concerned? Now, let's look at resilience by design, which is talking about climate risk protection through public-private synergy. So when markets cannot ensure what matters most, governments and innovators must build new shields. Every dollar invested in a risk reduction saves about $7 in disaster losses. Very, very important point. Let me repeat that. Every dollar invested in risk reduction will save up to $7 in disaster losses as per UNDDR Global Assessment Report 2022. Look at the kind of the rising need there is going to be because of the national climate resilience mechanisms, which is increasing the frequency and the intensity of climate disasters, which has been overwhelmed by traditional disaster relief funds. The governments are requiring innovative, scalable financial solutions to avoid economic collapse altogether post-disaster. You're having a public-private partnerships, PPP, pooling of the strengths together. They are leveraging private capital, analytics, innovation alongside the government oversight, the mandate. India has taken some initiatives in this regard, and SEBI and IRDAI, the regulatory, have come with a regulatory push. The SEBI has mandated that ESG and climate risk disclosures are needed to create transparency among the investor community so as to give them a confidence as far as green finance is concerned. IRDAI is promoting climate risk insurance products, ideas, and supporting parametric insurance development to protect and valuable or vulnerable sectors altogether. Then you have the African Risk Capacity, ARC, which is a region's complete success story altogether. The ARC is pooling across risk across member states by providing them swift insurance payouts to governments and disasters. Again, they're using parametric triggers and satellite data to ensure timely disaster and response and humanitarian aid. They have been supported by African Union and the World Bank, which is acting as a model for the climate resilience. So how do these climate risk pool work? Because they are essentially working in a collaborative framework where countries are paying premiums into a common pool. When an insurance event occurs, payouts are automatically triggered by an objective data, most important point, like your rainfall levels, your speed of the wind and other factors. Funds are disbursed rapidly for emergency relief so as to reduce the dependencies on slower international aid. And one of the biggest benefits is going to be, and for the future decision making, is in terms of speeds of recoveries, reduction in economic disruptions, protection of the vulnerable communities. This is encouraging the governments to invest in preemptive infrastructure, knowing financial risk is managed, increasingly integration with global capital finance and ESG investment frameworks. In coming slides and coming lecture series, we'll also talk about how this entire climate change, resilience tranches are being created so as to understand deeper how this is happening. Now, there is another important point, that's about broken links. So how the climate chaos is rewriting your entire global supply chains. The global supply chains are at the biggest risk, I would say. They are most vulnerable. So over 90% of Fortune 1000 companies saw supply chain disruptions from climate-related events in last 5 years. This is as per McKinsey 2022 reports. And what is happening is, because of this thing, the climate events are catalyzing, they're becoming the catalyst for supply chain disruptions. So acute physical risks like floods, your wildfires, your hurricanes, they're damaging your manufacturing plants, your farms, your ports, your transport routes. Let's take the case of Taiwan's 2021 out, which had threatened the entire semiconductor industry output altogether, which was affecting the industries worldwide. Then you have the vulnerability of key sectors like semiconductors. Because there is a concentrated production in climate-sensitive regions, the disruption is impacting electronics, automotive, and defense sectors. Agriculture, there's change in the rainfall, heat patterns, causing disruptions, reduction in buffer capacities. Then you have the financial and strategic implications as well. There's a reduction in cost from delayed shipments. There's a potential to downgrade for companies with fragile supply chains. There's a heightened focus on supply chain resilience in ESG investments. So you have the critical supply chain nodes that are under threat altogether. You have the recent, let's take the case of 2021 Taiwan that I just talked a few minutes ago. There's a complete supply chain disruption as far as chips were concerned. Then you had the flooding in the major agricultural markets regions that has led to the crop losses and increase in the food prices and inflation pressures that are happening across the world. This is having a cascading economic effect all the way. Down the line, there's a delay in all kind of products across the supply chain. Because there is a complex interdependencies and there's an amplification of vulnerabilities, just like in time manufacturing, there is a very little room to play around with delays or making the companies because there is going to be high penalties from the potential buyers. And therefore, you need to have a strategic importance of climate resilience supply chains, which is going to be becoming the most important point. And therefore, you will always find the supply chains will be one of the biggest challenges to be overcome as far as the climate change is concerned, the ESG factors are concerned, and that is where a lot of analytics needs to be understood and done. That also brings me to another point, is climate adjusted credit. How is my ESG going to hit my balance sheet? So over 90% of 1,000 Fortune companies or supply chain, as we saw about in the last 5 years. Now that is impacting your credit rating. You're not longer just dependent on a debt, but also on your emissions, your exposure, your ESG blind spots. And that is why the global credit rating agencies such as S&P Moody's, FITech, they have all formally integrated ESG factors, especially the climate risk, into their methodologies. And this shift is being acknowledged that poor climate risk management can undermine your credit worthiness by increasing your default risk. It is going to impact your borrowers, your corporates, your sovereigns with weak ESG profiles. You will face downgrades. There will be increase in borrowing cost. There will be limiting access to capital markets. There is going to be a systemic financial risk in terms of downgrading in high emission sectors that will create a ripple through the financial markets. There will be stress on how increasingly which needs to be incorporated as far as climate scenarios are concerned. Let's take the case of 2023 S&P downgrade that happened because of several fossil fuel producers citing transition risk and regulatory pressures that has triggered a sharp increase in bond yields altogether. So if you look at the strategic implications, the financial institutions and the military planners must understand the credit ratings and the shifts that are happening out there. So you have to integrate your ESG data into risk assessment so as to improve your long-term planning and resilience altogether. Now, that is where a forced movement is taking place. So by 2050, it is expected the world climate change would force over 216 million people across 6 world regions to migrate within their countries. This is as per World Bank Groundswell report. This is going to have a very big impact on the human lives you're looking at. Look at the way Africa is being impacted. Then it is being followed by South Asia or the entire Asia region. And then you have the East Asia and the Pacific region. Big issues are facing around because this will force into workforce displacement. Your local community will be under risk and there will be a lot of instability that will be caused. There will be operational risks that will be coming around because of the lack of business continuity. Strategic and military implications will be high because there will be huge humanitarian crisis that will be there in order to maintain your unrest. So the climate ESG and this climate risk is having all the way to the compliance and their core strategies that it needs to take in. So $4.3 trillion of global assets are at risk from the climate related impact by 2010. That is as per Swiss RE again. You look at the way your environment, governance, your strategies, your matrices that needs to be taken care of, your economics are at risk, what kind of assets you're looking at because of the extreme weather conditions, your misinformation, disinformation, everything is going to be there. The geopolitical implications, the strategic, technological implications that are going to be there. That also brings me to another point is what TCFD rather. Over 4,000 companies and organizations within a combined market capitalization of over $27 trillion going to support by TCFD frameworks, but that's as per TCFD status report. Now, what is TCFD actually? It's an established by Financial Stability Board, FSB, in 2015 to promote transparency, consistent climate-related financial disclosures. So it's got 4 pillars. You have governance, you have strategy, you have risk, and you have matrices. And each of them are quantifiable and identifiable. They are voluntary to mandatory shift. And why does this TCFD matters? Because it standardizes how companies communicate their climate exposures to investors. It encourages internal climate risk integrations. It forms foundations for other framework like ISSB, CSRD. You have investor expectations like global asset managers are talking about in terms of BlackRock or the State Street, As I said, it's got 4 pillars you're looking at. Governance, the oversight of the climate risks by board and management. The strategy, the climate risks that are required in planning and operations. You have the risk management, which requires your identification and mitigation of climate risks. Then you have matrices. What are your GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, your scenario analysis, your targets. How do you manage all these things? This is where, this TCFD becomes very important. Then you have ISSB, Global Language for Sustainability Reporting. The ISSB Global Baseline is expected to be adopted by over 40 jurisdictions by 2025. This is going to cover about 80% of global GDP. Now, look at this entire framework out here. So you have all the important players out there. You have got ISSB, which is launched by IFRS Foundation in 2021 to consolidate sustainability reporting. It has merged with ASB and DSB and VRF, which was formerly called as IIRC, and it has been aligned with TCFD, which is built on the 4 pillars, and it's got an overview. If you look at it, IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. So let's just talk about briefly what is IFRS S1. Let's talk about general sustainability related disclosure requirement, which is applying across industries, your disclosures about sustainability reports, opportunity. IFRS S2 is talking about climate specific disclosures, which has to be aligned with TCFD. You have to make a voluntary and shift towards G7, ISSB and ISCO working groups, which is mandating adoption of global policies across. It is important because the future of material ESG is what is being reflected across the enterprise values, and that is what is going to be important for all of us. Now, India's push is very important because we are a very important player in this entire game, because we are one of the biggest emerging economies, and it mandated that ESG disclosure top 1,000 listed companies. So we have made our own policy decisions as far as variability verification is concerned, accountability standards are concerned, your rating agencies are concerned, your reporting frameworks that have been coming into picture. So we just talked about TCFD. We have got our BRSR initiative that we talked about. Then you have the global principles that we need to align to, greenhouse gas protocols, PRI, sustainable development goals we're looking at. That also brings me to another point, is how is let's take a case study out here. The BRSR readiness India as far as Indian banking is concerned. Let's take the case of ICICI and HDFC, which has been leading the thing. Over 10,000 crore in green financing disbursed by lending by Indian banks in FY23. This is as per Ministry of Finance in Government of India. It is here that both the banks are proactively aligned with SEBI's BRSR format before it becomes mandatory by FY22 or 23. It became mandatory. Then if you look at the ICICI Bank, it disclosed alignment with multiple global frameworks such as TCFD, SASB, GRI, ESG governance structures through dedicated ESG communities. HDFC Bank, they have their own ESG KPIs embedded in the management scorecards, piloted by green deposits, ESG focused products. They have got scenario analysis, they have physical climate risk assessments that have been taking place. A few more points is about demystifying the global carbon metrics. You need to understand the scopes. So you have many firms that have got 90% plus of total emissions, which is lying in scope 3, and yet less than 30% disclosure inconsistency. So what do I mean to say by scopes? In the scope 1, you have direct emissions from the owned assets. So we were talking about scopes that are there, 90% of total emissions that are going to be there in lying good scope. Three different scopes. That is, the first scope is about direct emissions from the owned assets, where the company fleet vehicles or gas boilers are taking into account. You have the operational risk that needs to be taken into account, carbon tax that is to be taken into account. Then you have the scope 2, where you have indirect emissions from the purchased energy, like electricity from the data centers or offices. You have the energy risk, pricing risk that you have taken into account. You have RE 100 compliances that has to be taken into account. Then you have scope 3, which is all indirect emissions across the value chain, financed emissions, business travel, employee commuting, supply chain, all this has to be taken into account. Then you have something called as a climate value at risk. It's a very important concept, and you're talking about, how is the financial exposure is going to be there in the era of climate uncertainty. That is where you have estimated global financial assets about $4.2 trillion by 2100 as per the Economics Intelligence Unit in 2015. So what is climate value at risk? It is a forward-looking risk matrix where you're quantifying the potential financial losses in a portfolio due to climate-related risks. It is essentially estimating the losses, which is going to be ranging from climate scenarios such as 2 degrees centigrade, 1.5 degrees centigrade, etc. And you're factoring both the transition risk, whether it's in terms of carbon pricing, regulatory changes, physical risks such as extreme weather, sea level rises. So climate value at risk is being adopted at large institutional levels so as to reassess your portfolio resilience, identify your stranded assets, alignment of investments that are there. And that is where your traditional value at risk and climate adjusted value at risk is becoming very, very important. So take the case of risk, risk scoping itself. In the traditional value at risk, you had the market and the credit risk. In the new climate adjusted value at risk, you have the transition and the physical climate at risk. In traditional value at risk, the horizon was from days to months, and here you are looking at 10 to 30 years, which is a long-term exposure. So now this green and brown financing is becoming an important point, where you're looking at the measurement in terms of business transition. So only 5% of globally listed companies are deriving more than 20% of their revenues from the green bonds and services. This is as per FTSE Result 2023 report. What is a brown exposure? A revenue or an asset exposure tied to carbon-intensive or environmentally damaging activities such as fossil fuel extraction, coal-based power plants, decarbonization-linked supply chains is what is called as a brown exposure. And this is why the green-brown ratio matters, because it is helping the investors assess the transition risk. It is reflecting the company's trajectory. It is supporting the regulatory reporting systems such as EU taxonomy, CSRD. That's why it's become very important. And if you look at the scenario analysis, it's talking about, the introduction of various scenario analysis and stress testings. The NGFS climate scenarios, or like whether it is orderly scenarios, when you're assuming a smooth and transition to low carbon economies at the clear policy guidelines, which will be having implications as far as lower physical risk are concerned, managed transition costs, gradual asset revaluation. You have the hot house world, where it is representing a future with a minimal climate policy responses, severe physical impacts are dominating. We'll be looking in terms of their banks, which is about using stress-based testing scenarios to adjust their credit risk models, the capital allocations, their portfolio resilience, the scenarios outcomes that will be there will be guided by investment decisions, the influence of the divestment strategies. For insurance companies, it's going to be about scenario analysis, quantifying the potential losses from increase in claim frequencies and severity, adjustment in pricing models for premium, and assessment in the viability of reinsurance arrangements. And that brings us to the end of this lecture series, or the first of the kind, on ESG and analytics in green finance. That's myself. Thank you. Swayam Prabha is a very good channel to be associated with, not only as an educator but also as a student. It gives you an opportunity to learn new subjects from industry experts like myself, and also from various professors who are there and experts are there in the field. So this is a new course that I'll be teaching. It talks about ESG, it talks about the analytics around ESG, it talks about the various green financial instruments that are there. We'll talk about risk pooling, we'll discuss about what is the nature of weather indexes, what is the nature of finance that is happening, how is the industry looking at it, what are the legal perspectives, what are the technological perspectives, and also most importantly, what is the analytics perspective that we'll be bringing it out. Swayam Prabha has this government website which is called swayamprabha.gov.in. All you need to do is go down, drill it out, figure out which course is most appropriate for you so that you can find out the best one that is available and which is most applicable for your area of learning. As far as this, the way it is challenged, it is transforming the entire education system, because you see there are a lot of people out there who are spread across the country and they want to get access to good quality education given by professors, experts. This is one of the very good channels to be in.